They say you should never meet your heroes. Well, I'm not sure that phrase quite applies to the concept of this video, but I have very fond memories of the A168WA from the early 2000s. Maybe not quite enough to think of it as heroic, but still. If I'm honest, my memory is hazy thinking that far back, and I could be getting my timings a little muddled there. Apologies if I am. A lot of modern media products rely heavily on nostalgia for sales, and if you look at the homogenization of the watch industry with its penchant for borrowed history, there is definitely some crossover going on there. In the budget sector, Casio is fairly unique because they aren't always bringing back models from the back catalogue. In a lot of cases, they have simply never stopped producing them. The focus of this video is to look at whether or not going down memory lane and buying a watch you remember from your past is the right path to take, or if those memories are best left alone. With all that said, let's get into the video. To begin with, let's talk about the watch itself. Essentially, the A168WA is an upgraded version of the iconic F91W. For brevity, we'll just call them the A16 and the F91 from this point on. In reality, whether or not you view the changes made as an upgrade or not is going to come down to personal opinion. Let's look at the differences and weigh up the pros and cons. The F91 has a resin case and bracelet, giving it a more minimalist, rugged and utilitarian feel. The A16 actually also has a resin case, but it's covered with a chrome-like coating to give it a metallic appearance. The bracelet on the A16 is stainless steel, giving the watch a more premium feel to it overall. And while both watches are very light, the A16 comes in 30 grams heavier, mostly down to that bracelet. While you could make the argument that the stainless steel bracelet looks better, I think it's hard to argue that the wearing experience is actually worse. The clasp, while functional, is fiddly, and if you're blessed with hairy arms, you can expect to lose a few hairs fairly regularly. It isn't purely the bracelet that adds weight. The A16 is a bigger model, with a larger display. That makes it a millimetre wider, 3 taller and 1.1 thicker. Neither are big watches, but the A16 does command more wrist presence, and that metallic look only helps to further that feeling. The dimensions and materials used are not the only points of difference. The A16 has an electroluminescent dial. This illuminates the entire screen, whereas the F91 only has a small LED, which only really lights up one half of the display. In my view, this is one clear point of victory for the A16. Price-wise, there should be a gap between the two, and you'll generally find F91s for less online, but the gap is actually really small when you factor in sales and other promotions. The stated battery life is 7 years for both models, and the water resistance rating is 30 meters for both as well. The F91, however, is definitely the more iconic model, having been in production since 1989. It's one of the most recognisable watches on the planet. In my eyes, it's the watch equivalent of the Honda Super Cub, and anyone who has visited the Far East will know what I mean by that. While less iconic, the A16 is what I personally have nostalgia for. And while I own an F91, because I'd feel like a bit of a fraud if I didn't, it doesn't hold the same level of attachment for me as it might for others. Now, the observant among you will realise, but wait, that isn't the A168W you're showing us footage of. No, you're quite right, it isn't. This is the A158W, a smaller version with more minimal dial print and no electroluminescent dial. So I'm going to peel back the curtain here for a moment and explain what's happened. This video is correctly titled, and I am talking quite specifically about my experiences with the A168WA. but mine actually broke during the trip where this footage was filmed. I wasn't able to find a like-for-like replacement, and so got one of these A158 models as a stand-in. Far from ideal, I know, but just so you're aware why I'm talking about one model while showing footage of a similar but slightly different one on screen. Being the age that I am, 37 for reference, I feel like I've gone through a bit of a roller coaster when it comes to technology and watches in particular. From my childhood, where I felt like any devices that had some kind of electronic capability were just the coolest thing ever. For example, the original Game Boy, the Sega Mega Drive, early Casio watches from my youngest days, robot toys that could move around and pick things up, and I even distinctly remember being excited about owning an electronic filofax. My god, that seems so distant and yet still somehow so tragic. My favourite movies as a kid were the short circuit films, Return of the Jedi and Batteries Not Included. I just found technology so cool. It seems so contradictory to me now that I have devices that can do all of the things that I once dreamed they would, and all I want is a break from them. If it weren't for using it as a recording device, I genuinely think I might be happier living without a smartphone. And at this point, I refuse to wear a smartwatch at all. In my line of work, and with my video making and gaming hobbies, I spend more than enough time staring at a screen already. I think that's why digital watches still appeal to me. They've got that promise of functionality without the requirement for charging or intrusive notifications and demands for updates and internet connections. It was with this kind of perspective that I bought my A16, in the hopes that wearing one again would rekindle some of that childhood love for technology. The reality of the situation though is that, as with all things, times and tastes have moved on, and just like with nostalgia in the media, it rarely, if ever, lives up to your original experiences. Now, unlike those media experiences, this isn't some half-baked reimagining, unnecessary sequel or prequel. This is in essence the same as it was. I come to realise then that the thing that has changed is me. My wrist is bigger, my experience with watches is broader, and my tastes are slightly different from what they were. I still think this is a great watch, but while not uncomfortable to wear, it simply isn't as nice an experience on wrist as the F91W. And if I had to pick between the two, despite the personal haze of nostalgia, unfortunately it just isn't the A168WA that gets the wrist time. And that doesn't just apply to a direct comparison with the F91W. I have a budding Casio collection, and the reality is that this is actually at the bottom of that pile at this point, behind my calculator watch, G-Shocks, World Time Illuminator, and a few new additions that you'll see featured on the channel soon. Nostalgia just isn't enough for me anymore, and just as media producers seem to be finally clocking on, doesn't guarantee success at the box office either. I didn't want this watch to go to waste though, and as I have a daughter who is just as keen with technology as I once was, I decided to gift it to her. Learning to tell the time with an analog display is a preferable skill in my opinion, but both formats have value, and I think in the grand scheme of things, she's going to be reading the time in a digital format far more often, let's be real. One benefit of the bracelet is that it can be sized to fit even very small wrists, and while it was flavour of the month with her for a while, actually this watch spent quite a while as a makeshift clock wrapped around one of her bedposts so she could see the time in the morning. Now, you're far more likely to see her checking the time on her Apple Watch or iPad, and while I'm not a fan of either of these things particularly, trying to stem that steady flow of brain rot that's targeted at children feels a bit like standing on a beach as the tide comes in and telling it to stop. I can only hope that in the future she'll have fond memories of her time with the A168W and remember how in part it taught her how to tell the time. I have to be honest though, like me, I'm not sure I'd recommend her going and buying one just for nostalgic purposes though. As an aside here, I've gifted her the A168W as well, and we'll just have to hope it fares better in the longevity stakes. If I were to make suggestions for alternative options to this model, outside of the obvious F91W, I would look at the Timex T80, which I think looks really cool in all black. The Casio A100 and W800 ranges are also great options. Now that's not to try and denigrate the A168. I think that at this price point you're going to be better off with a resin strap though, or paying extra for a model on a better bracelet. The other suggestion I would have to that end is looking at the modding scene for this watch. Just like other inexpensive Casios, including the World Time Illuminator I featured on the channel recently, there are lots of models available for the A168. Popular options include hydro modding the dial, upgrading the display, and of course case and bracelet upgrades, which would completely change the wearing experience, for a price of course. As ever, thank you for your time. If you've enjoyed what you've seen or found it informative, consider dropping the video a like and subscribing if you want to see more content like this.